Pete Calandra here, and today's video will be something a bit different. My first vlog where I'm just going to talk about one of my musical experiences. I'm hoping that some of the younger musicians that might watch this will find it useful. I'll be breaking this up into two parts. The first half about the initial experience, and the second half with what followed. If you like this video, give a thumbs up. For more content, please subscribe, and to be notified, ring that bell. Thanks for watching, and let's get right into it. As humans, we tend to put special emphasis on certain amounts of time passing. 10-year spans of time as anniversaries seem to be especially noteworthy. Some of you that have been following me or watching my YouTube videos, or those of you tuning in for the first time and don't know me at all, may not be aware that I had a 30-plus year career as one of the busiest freelance keyboard players in New York City. I played in some of the biggest Broadway shows. I was in the Radio City Musical Orchestra for a summer back in 1984, played jazz in clubs, worked in recording studios, played on stage at Carnegie Hall with the New York Pops, and accompanied singers in concerts. One of my biggest gigs, though, was being hired in the fall of 1990 to be the principal keyboard player for the original Broadway production of Miss Saigon. I had become aware of the show in 1989 from the West End production in London, and was fortunate enough to know the entire music staff and have the right skills and be at the right place at the right time to get hired for the show. 30 years ago today, January 28, 1991, was the very first day of cast rehearsals, and 20 years ago today, January 28th of 2001, was the last performance. I was in the show for the entire 10 years and probably played over 3,000 total performances. Despite some of the shortcomings with the material in the show, it was a massive hit and had advance sales of over $30 million, which was a record at the time. And the steady work for such a prolonged period of time gave me stability and also enabled me to take the steps needed to move into composing music for films and television. On this day 30 years ago, the entire cast, creative staff, stage management, and music staff of Miss Saigon came together at 890 Studios in the Flatiron District of New York. 890 Studios was started by the late Michael Bennett, and by 1991 it was the home to the American Ballet Theatre, the Feld Ballet, Gibney Dance Studios, and many Broadway shows used the studios there to rehearse. Over the next 6 weeks, we put the show together piece by piece by working 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. And often after a long day of rehearsal, I would come home and spend an hour or two at night going over the next day's material, as I was also learning the music during these rehearsals. Now, for those of you that don't know, the show is through composed, meaning that every second of the show is music with no book scenes. The entire rehearsal period was an amazing time, as the Vietnam War was the background for my childhood, but many in the cast were too young to really know how intense that was in America, and so part of the rehearsal period was spent watching documentaries about the war, both in Vietnam and also the reaction here in America, to give the young cast a sense of the history to help with their performance. While I had been playing shows in New York City for 9 years by this time, I'd not helped with putting a show together from the beginning, so this was a really new and incredibly valuable experience for me, and also helped me to create relationships with the amazing cast, and I'm still friends with many of them today. Some of the highlights of this period for me were accompanying Lea Salonga on her solos for the first time, and being incredibly overwhelmed by the power and beauty of her voice. Another moment I've never forgotten was the first full run-through of the scene where the American embassy was being evacuated. This was the show's reenactment of that famous scene you may have seen in photographs and in newsreels of helicopters taking off from the roof of the American embassy, with people desperately trying to escape before Saigon was overrun by the North Vietnamese. The cast was so full of energy and committed to the performance that we were all emotionally drained by the end of it. We had 5 people on the day-to-day music staff: Bob Billig, who was one of the music supervisors and would conduct the show, David Caddick, who was the other music supervisor, Jay Alger, who was the associate conductor and played the second keyboard chair, and Beth Fremgen, who was the rehearsal pianist and would also play the second keyboard chair when Jay was conducting. As we closed in on when tech rehearsals and previews would start, Bob, Jay, and I would meet at the Hammerstein Ballroom in the Manhattan Center on West 34th Street to rehearse the show with the full orchestra. After a few days of rehearsal with just the orchestra, we had the first sitzprobe with the cast. Once this was done, we moved into the Broadway theater to do tech rehearsals. This time period was so intense as we had developed a comfortable routine at 890 Studios, but now we had so many more people and other variables tossed into the mix. Long and stressful days made more intense by the controversies and protests surrounding the show. Now, I'm not commenting on who was right or who was wrong, just giving you a sense of what was going on outside the show that was adding pressure on us. There were people who were upset that an English actor, Jonathan Pryce, was hired to play a Eurasian character, the engineer. There were also people who were upset at the way that the cast of Asian women were being portrayed. There were daily protests outside the theater, and at one performance, protesters were in the audience and tried to disrupt the performance. Even though the story, based on Madame Butterfly by Puccini, was in essence a dramatic love story, there was also quite a bit of subtext to the show. One of these subtexts was the way it portrayed America in an incredibly negative light. This was evident to me when I went to London for 3 days at the beginning of January of 1991 to sit in the West End pit and watch the band, and also to sit in the audience to see the show. It was really almost a vulgar and nasty portrayal of Americans, and by the time we were in tech rehearsals, the show's producer, Cameron McIntosh, was concerned that it would be poorly received by the audience, so he instructed the director, Nicholas Heitner, who's a fantastic director, by the way, to tone that down a little bit. On March 19, 1991, tech rehearsals gave way to previews. We did 19 previews. During this time, there were still full orchestra and cast rehearsals during the day, and we opened on April 11, 1991. There was a big reception after the show at the famous Sardi's in the Theater District, as well as a huge opening party for hundreds of people at the Winter Garden Atrium down at the World Financial Plaza in Manhattan. The show received mixed but generally good reviews. I think the good reviews were mostly due to the incredible energy put out on a nightly basis by the cast, many of whom were in their first Broadway show. They were also very young, very talented, and very enthusiastic. And not least by the principal cast members, Lea Salonga, Jonathan Pryce, Hinton Battle, Liz Calloway, and Willie Falk. These were all amazing performers. It was incredibly exciting with so much intense, high-pressure work happening in a short period of time. Another highlight for me, on a personal note, was getting my late mother in to see opening night, to come down backstage, get a tour, to sit in the pit, play the keyboard that I was playing, and also to come to the party at Sardi's and down at the Winter Garden. I know she really enjoyed that, and I'm really thankful I was able to do that. At this point, I'd like to move to the second half of this vlog and talk about the realities of being in a long-running show. Despite some negative things I'll be talking about, I'm grateful to have been in the show and had steady work for a decade. I'll talk about the positive aspects of the situation as well. The first few months of the run were very exciting as the combination of being a hot ticket, the show was sold out in advance for the first year, and the realization I had actually pulled off being hired for the show sank in. During the entire rehearsal period, I was so focused in on the work of learning and watching the show being put together that I wasn't really able to enjoy the accomplishment. In late May of 1991, I played on all the pre-records at Clinton Studio Manhattan for the Saigon segment of the Tonys. On June 2nd of that year, the Tonys were broadcast nationally. I'll put a link in the description box below for the performance. The show was nominated for 13 Tonys and won 3. Jonathan Pryce, Lea Salonga, and Hinton Battle won Tony Awards for their performances, but the show was shut out for the rest of the nominations. Once this honeymoon period was over, the realities of playing the same music night in and night out started to hit home. The show was extremely difficult to play, and quite a bit of the orchestrations were centered around both of the keyboard books. The piano book I was playing was technically demanding, and I was physically drained after each performance. There's a saying on Broadway, give as much as you can give 8 times a week. That was a bit difficult to do with a piece so technically difficult that also required quite a bit of emotional energy to work. One thing that most people don't think about is that if you're an instrumentalist, you use your own instrument to play on every night. Keyboard players are given a setup that they have to conform or adapt to. Back in the early 1990s, the weighted action of keyboard controllers was not as refined as it is today, and the Elka controller that the keyboard programmer provided was extremely difficult to play. Additionally, sampler technology was not very advanced yet. We used, at the beginning of the run, Roland S750 samplers that had only 18 megabytes of RAM. I think we had 2 of them for each keyboard part, and all of the sounds created for the show had to fit into that smaller sample space. This led to issues with the piano and electric piano sounds. The original piano sound they tried to use was an incredibly poor sample, and the electric piano sound they wanted for many of the big songs like Last Night of the World and I Still Believe had an incredibly sluggish response, which meant I had to physically play ahead of the beat in order to sound in time with the rest of the orchestra. Eventually, we convinced everyone to use a Roland controller and an EMU piano module for the acoustic piano sounds. The latency with the roller samplers still remained, but at least the piano sound, which was the bulk of what I played, was acceptable. The entire system was upgraded to a pair of Kurzweil K2500 keyboards with 256 megs of RAM, 1 for each keyboard player, and both the sonic quality and responsiveness of the keyboard was much, much better. That only took a couple of years to sort out. Today, with apps like Mainstage and much better controllers, you can get amazing sounding keyboard setups that are really comfortable to play. Another issue with the show, and shows in general, is the actual volume in the pit. Miss Saigon had many incredibly loud and bombastic moments, and most of the pit was covered. This left very little space for the sound to escape. To play a few shows was not an issue, but to play many shows weekly over time caused quite a bit of discomfort, and I used to have to wear earplugs and, on the loudest moments, gun mufflers as well. Not really something I wanted to do, but I felt the need to protect my hearing from damage. The last negative issue I'd like to talk about is that while I made many long-lasting friendships with people that played in the show, being in a pit orchestra for a long-running show is an interesting psychology experiment. You have creative, talented, educated, and vastly overqualified people set up in a small space, playing the exact same music night after night. Many issues that in real life would be no big deal get magnified and exacerbated. There are people that I played with in that show that I would avoid working with again. Enough with the negative stuff, let's move on to some of the benefits. The main benefit is the stability. You know your schedule and can plan out a life with a little more ease than a freelancer or touring musician. I quickly got into a schedule and would spend my days working on new skills, and then around 4 p.m., take a nap, get up, take a shower, have dinner, and get to the show by about 7:15 so that I could make sure my setup was working and warm up for the 8:05 start time. About a year into the run, I realized that I'd been working in theater in New York City for about a decade and had gotten as far up the career ladder as I could. Most keyboard players strive to be conductors and music directors, and while I had experienced that, it was not something I really wanted to pursue in the future, so that made my options going forward limited. With that in mind, I decided to take all of the music technology experience I had acquired by embracing MIDI in the mid-1980s and poured it over to a computer-based sequencer. So I purchased a Mac LC2 and opcode Vision software and started to learn how to create music in the computer, a skill that would become invaluable to me later on in the 1990s as I started to get work composing music for films and television. I was also able to go back to college part-time and complete my master's degree in composition, where I was fortunate enough to study with Thea Musgrave and Jimmy Heath. These are 2 amazing musicians, and if you don't know who they are, I will put a link to their wiki pages in the description box below. Another benefit for me was playing on a nightly basis with people who also played in the New York Philharmonic, the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, St. Luke's Orchestra. They played as extras or they were in the pool for these other performing situations. These were some of the busiest and best New York City musicians, and they really inspired me to up my game to make sure that I could fit in. When I was younger and playing for a living in clubs and weddings to pay for undergraduate school, I was always playing in a rhythm section. This was also true of my first really big gig, the original off-Broadway Little Shop of Horrors. It was a rhythm section band of 4 musicians. I started to get experience playing in a larger, more orchestral setting by being hired to program and play the synthesizer book for the last Radio City Music Hall summer show in 1984 titled Gotta Get Away. But it wasn't until 1988 when I started working at Phantom of the Opera that I really learned how to play with a conductor and to fit into an orchestra setting. The benefits of this for me was that by playing night after night in an orchestra, I really learned how these instruments sounded and how they are written for and how they are used orchestrationally to bring out the emotion in a piece of music. Having to phrase and make my parts fit in with strings, winds, and brass on a nightly basis really informed the execution of orchestral music I started to get with my film and television music. Another benefit is meeting and hiring other keyboard players. I had a stable of subs, or as they say in England, deputies, that I could hire to sit in for me when I needed to take off from the show. Passing around work to other musicians is always a good thing, and one of my former subs later became my employer after Miss Saigon closed when I started to sub for her at The Lion King. At first, I only took off to do another gig, but after a while, I would also just need a break from the 8-show-a-week grind and would schedule out my week to do 6 shows. This way, I could stay fresh and also have a bit of a social life at times. Starting around 1998, composing work started to come in, and I would spend my days composing and recording, and then cut my schedule back to about 5 shows a week, only playing the night performances and taking off 1 additional night each week. As being in a Broadway show is a union gig, I also got health insurance, vacation pay, and pension donations for the entire run. In April of 2000, there was a meeting before the show where we were all informed that the run would end on December 31st of that year. At that point, I was ready, but it was still nice to get an almost 8-month notice to get prepared for the next stage of my career. Lea Salonga came back towards the end to finish the run, and we were extended till January 28th of 2001, and that put a nice 10-year time frame on my involvement with the show. I remember sitting in the pit of the Broadway theater before that last performance, looking up at the huge chandelier hanging from the ceiling and thinking that I may never play another show again, and just let that feeling sink in. It had been over 19 years since my first performance at Little Shop of Horrors, which was a big chunk of my life. There was a closing night party afterwards, and just like that, I went from being a keyboard player in a big hit show to being unemployed. I was so fried at this point that I didn't touch my piano for 4 months. Fortunately, I wasn't totally unemployed. I had some savings and also work as a composer. I'd been renting a space in a larger studio on West 49th Street and committed to trying to write full-time for a living. And that's been an amazing second career for me. It actually turned out not to be the last time I played a show, as by the end of 2001, I started to sub at The Lion King, and for the next 15 years played 2 of the 3 keyboard books there, anywhere from 80 to 120 performances a year. I did completely stop playing shows in April of 2016, as after 34 years, it was incredibly difficult for me to really have any enjoyment and to actually concentrate on doing a good job. By this point, I had already been teaching at Queens College for several years and was working steadily as a composer, and really felt finally like turning the page. I'm proud of having been in Miss Saigon, and while there were definite downsides to being in a long run, I'm eternally grateful for the experience. It changed my life for the better. I hope this has been enjoyable. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. Please leave any comments or questions below. I've been Pete Calandra, and I'll catch you on the next one.